And I have to say, I know this literature quite well, but all your discussions of the different theories of consciousness, the different theories of the self, mind uploading, all that stuff is so good. It's really the best kind of one package summary I've read anywhere. So well done.
Very kind of you to say. Thanks for the kind words about the book.
Yeah. So, but before we get into all the details, what's your story? How'd you get into, well, just in general, neuroscience and psychology and all that? And then how'd you get taken down this path?
Yeah, I think basically for as long as I can remember, I've always been fascinated by science and technology and philosophy and sort of where we've come from in terms of technological development and where we're going. When I was a really little kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. I thought that was the coolest thing, and rockets are just going to keep getting better and better. But as an Australian, as I got a bit older, I realized it's pretty hard to become an astronaut. But I was also fascinated with neuroscience. And in particular, I think neuroscience is so fun because it's the combination of like the big philosophical questions of like, how are we conscious? How do we hold on to memories? What's the nature of free will? These sorts of things, in combination with the fun nitty gritty of like, how do squishy cells and chemical reactions actually give rise to these processes? And then also the medical applications of like, can we put this stuff to work in helping people live healthier, longer lives? And as part of that, I think I've always been kind of fascinated with what I get into in the book, which is this like science fiction idea of like, well, what is it that we can't do today, but we might be able to do in the future? And are these ideas that are explored in science fiction, like which ones are going to become real and which ones are forever going to be fake? Because you look back 100 years and you see like, wow, we've improved technology so much. I've always been curious about like, what is still to come? So I guess I've been a bit of a dilettante in neuroscience in that I did my PhD on just behavioral neuroscience, how genes and environment interact to shape cognition. I then switched after my PhD to the study of consciousness. So how is it that brains are associated with consciousness, give rise to consciousness? What is the relationship? And then more recently, I've become interested in the material that I talk about in the book about, is it possible to put people into stasis, preserve brains, upload all of those ideas in a way that's actually compatible with extending people's lives?
Yeah, nice. So as you know, there's about at least 2 billion people in the world who already know the answer to this question. We get to live forever. It says so right there in John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, that if you accept him, you get eternal life. Now, you don't deal with the religious versions of the afterlife and immortality in the book, but how do you think about that? We could just kind of put that aside after you give us a thought on that.
So as probably many members of your audience would agree with, I don't find the explanatory power of soul-based accounts of immortality particularly compelling, in that I just feel like there's a lot of questions they can't answer. So I go through at length in the book, for example, about all these circumstances where people have acquired brain injuries or trauma or chemical-induced changes to their personality and goals and desires and memories in a way that really seems to associate changes in brain structure and function to changes in the core nature of who a person is. And I struggle when I look at soul-based accounts to see how a immaterial soul could explain any of those psychological changes. So it's not something I personally find particularly compelling. Now, it'd be great if, there's a guarantee of an afterlife through a soul-based account. And if that is the case, I guess what I'm advocating for shouldn't take away from that. I don't think any of the scientific techniques being advertised are capable of soul binding or soul manipulation, as far as I'm aware. But essentially, yeah, I put it to the side because I don't have a lot of useful stuff to say about it, in that I think what I'm talking about is more useful for those who are a bit skeptical of a religious afterlife to begin with.
Yeah. Well, certainly that's my position as well. I guess the argument would be if dualism was true and there really was something like a soul or a mind or whatever floating around separate from the neurons and the synapses and all that, and then when you die, it floats off the brain and off into the quantum ether or wherever it goes. When you have brain damage or something, where does Aunt Millie's mind go when her neurons die of Alzheimer's disease? Well, if you have a soul, they should be still intact somewhere, right? Because how would they float off later when you're dead? So, or any kind of brain function, it should still be there. Is that kind of the argument for the dualism?
Yeah, I mean, so the dualist accounts I mean, they're centuries old. They could start with Descartes, who posited that consciousness somehow, our minds arise from an immaterial soul that somehow interfaces with our brains and bodies to control our bodies, give us our subjective experiences, those sorts of things. And there are still today like serious philosophers who advocate for, or at least try and argue for, a dualistic account. But the challenge they have is the mind-body problem. Like, how does the soul interact with the body, interact with the brain in a way that actually explains anything? And I like, if you take the interface problem seriously, Descartes tried to argue that something happens in the pineal gland to allow the interface. I guess if that's the correct, then like eventually we should be able to do science on that, work out how it works, and then manipulate it that way. But yeah, I don't see a lot of compelling accounts for explanations based on soul-based accounts. So I don't spend a lot of time on them.
Yeah, I'm always curious in these ghost movies. How does the ghost know to turn right at the end of the hallway and then open the door? And how does it knock the picture off the wall? But
I'm more confused by where are all the ghosts, in that, like, even if you just count Homo sapiens, there've been like 120 billion of us over time. Right. Like, do they fade out after a while, or what are the actual mechanics of them?
They go to cows in India. But to be a little more serious, the mind-body problem, does that still not exist even for monists who think there is no mind, it's just brain? Well, then how does consciousness, this kind of, I don't know, just the thoughts of something, cause my neurons to fire and my arm to move? Something like that. Is that still not a problem?
These are a problem for every theory of consciousness that exists at the moment, both philosophical and neuroscientific. You just get to choose which is your hard problem that you'd like to deal with. So the dualists have to explain the soul-body interaction, or the mind-body interaction. Monists, so monism, most commonly neutral monism is the most common theory, is the idea that somehow the physical and the mental are the same thing if just viewed properly. The difficulty with that one is, like, how do you actually show that they certainly seem like they're different things, in that my subjective experiences aren't obviously to me also somehow simultaneously a physical entity. So that's a difficulty for them. And then the other main school is physicalism, like the idea that actually everything is just physical. And if you could view subjective experience, mental stuff the right way, then you'd realize that actually it's just chemical reactions, physical stuff deep down. Of which the most like dramatic versions of that are things like what's called eliminative materialism, which Dan Dennett made famous, or its more modern account is something called illusionism, who Keith Frankish is famous for saying, which illusionism is basically the idea that when we think we have subjective experiences like qualia, like the redness of red, in a way that's different from just our functional abilities, we're actually mistaken about that. It's an illusion. It's really, if we could just like think about it properly, we'd realize it's all just physical processes and confused behavior and stuff. And the advantage of that one, obviously, is that you don't have to deal with the hard problem of consciousness anymore if you just say it's an illusion. But the difficulty is that most people, including most philosophers, think it's an insane position to be denying our subjective experiences. So they each have their problem.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems like there can also be I know this from Deepak Chopra and a group of his people, that they are monists. They say consciousness is the ground of all being. It is first. It is primary. There's nothing underneath it, and everything else follows from it. So the material world is just a derision. It was derived from consciousness in some way.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit more like what I would know as an idealistic. I think it's called idealism, which is like the physical comes from the mental. I mean, the problem with that one is just like, it seems how science is so good, starting from the assumption that everything is physical and going on from there, like post-Galilean ideas of third-person objective science. So you really got to have a very solid new theory if you're going to have something that does better than that, I would say.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, reading Oliver Sacks's books, if you get damage to the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobe on the left side, and all of a sudden you can't see faces anymore. Well, that seems pretty obvious that it was the neurons in there that were running the facial recognition software, and that's gone now. If dualism was true, or if consciousness, then that should still exist somewhere.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. All right. So while we're on this subject, before we get to death and dying and all that, so you nicely review all the leading theories of consciousness to solve the. First of all, what is the hard problem? What is it that needs to be solved? And there's a dozen different theories, but what are your, I don't know, top 3 or 4 favorites? And is it, how do you see a way to like test which is the right one? As you know, Christoph Koch just lost his bet to David Chalmers last April. That they'd solve it in 25 years, and now the 25 years is up, and he had to pay him a case of wine or something.
Yeah, that's right. That was,
is it going to take another 25 years, or is it an insoluble problem just because of the way they're phrasing it? Or, I mean, what are your thoughts on all that?
So the hard problem with consciousness is the question of how is it that physical things, brains, computers, whatever entity you have in mind, could actually give rise to subjective experience or is associated with subjective experience. And it's a hard problem because it seems like you could have like an extremely good description of how the brain works, or how a computer works, or how anything works, like down to the level of its lowest level causal mechanisms, whether that's molecules or switches or neurons. And still, you'd be able to explain the behavior of the entity. You'd be able to explain what it does, how it does it. But it seems like you'd always be leaving out an explanation of its internal subjective experience. So you might be able to give a perfect description of how my brain works without saying, but that's why red feels the way it does, or that's why pain feels as painful as it does, or that's why beautiful music sounds so beautiful to me. And this stands in contrast to what David Chalmers terms easier problems, which is just explaining how memory works, or explaining how I can control my arm, or any of those sorts of things. And it seems difficult, as we were alluding to, because science does third-person objective descriptions of like, well, if you manipulate these components, then you get these behaviors as a result. But it doesn't seem to have a way of explaining the subjective experiences I was just mentioning. So that's the problem for any scientific or any theory of consciousness. That being said, there are theories that attempt to explain it. So we mentioned a few of the philosophical ideas, but in terms of neuroscientific theories, sort of the more prominent ones at the moment are, one is global workspace theory, which is within the subset of what's called functionalism, where functionalism is the idea that any brain, computer, anything that performs the right functions will correspondingly have subjective experience along with that. So, for example, if some animal can think about and plan its actions and communicate with its other animals and can seem to react to stimuli in its environment, then because it can do all those functions, then there must be something that it feels like to be that creature. And if it was made of silicon instead of biology, then that wouldn't matter. That's probably the most common theory amongst neuroscientists at the moment. But the issue with it is it doesn't really seem very good at explaining why things feel the way they do. It struggles with questions like, why does red feel like red and not green or something? Like, it doesn't really explain why particular functions come along with particular subjective experiences. So in contrast, you have theories which say, well, maybe we should be starting with subjective experience and trying to understand that really well, and then trying to associate that with some causal structure or mechanism or function or whatever it is that gives rise to it. So there's big school of neuroscientific thought called causal structure theories, of which the most prominent member is a theory called integrated information theory, which thinks that, well, if you look at what it's like to have subjective experience, then it seems like I'm always experiencing like a very definitive thing. So I see the room in front of me rather than a hazy collection of different experiences at once. And it also seems like my experiences are integrated. Like I can hear the audio and I can see your face at the same time rather than disconnected. And it goes through a whole bunch of these like sort of observations about subjective experience and then says, on the basis of this, I think that consciousness is structured in this way and that we should be looking for some physical structure that seems to be related to that in some way. It gets very technical, so I'll leave the technical description there. The difficulty this theory has, though, is it both seems to explain too much. So if you end up going through these causal structure stuff, then you have criticisms of it where people are like, well, it seems like using that argument, you could say a big grid of switches should be super conscious, which is unintuitive. And yeah, that's probably the main criticism, but there's a variety of other ones as well. So it's also not accepted by more than a quarter or a third of the neuroscientific community. My actual position on any of these is that I don't see a near-term solution to the hard problem, because I think the hard problem still holds. And there's actually a very good paper by a couple of scientists, who I'll give credit to, Johannes Kleiner and Eric Hurl, that came out a couple of years ago, where they sort of give a mathematical proof of the hard problem, saying that it doesn't seem clear that it ever can actually be solved experimentally. It's something that needs to be solved from like logic and philosophy first, unless you have radical revisions to our understanding of physics or the nature of reality or that sort of thing. So this does get very technical, but that's the overall idea, where I actually struggle to see a solution in the near term.
Yeah.
And as a result, you have people like, I think you've had Anil Seth on your show before, who talk that what we need to do actually is step back for a while, just collect a whole bunch more neuroscience about consciousness, subjective experience, and then maybe tackle the problem again in a while, once we've got more data.
I think either that or just reconceptualize it in some entirely different way. Because if you think about it, I mean, you always hear this phrase to define consciousness, what it's like to be something. You know, what it's like to be a bat or a dolphin or something like that. Well, how would I know? I'm a human. And, you know, I could bolt on some, big ears or some kind of echolocation system, but I would still need the neural networks to process that information. And even if you somehow put brain transplants in there that allow me to process echolocation information, you know, at some point, if I really knew what it was like to be a bat or a dolphin, I would just be a bat or a dolphin, and I wouldn't be asking, oh, so this is what it's like, as if the human me is still in there somewhere, aware that it's not the thing that it's in, but it now knows what it's like to be that thing. It's sort of like those movies, Freaky Friday, where Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan switch bodies, right? And then the teenage girls in the corporate boardroom and the middle-aged mom is in high school and hilarity ensues. Well, this is not possible. You are your body. You can't switch bodies.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole problem. This is why it's a first-person issue rather than just third-person observations. Fine. We can explain bat behavior, but we don't know what it feels like to be a bat.
Yeah, right. So I wonder if, Thomas Nagel, what it's like to be a bat, but his other work on, that's one thought too many, when he was asked, can you use rationality to prove rationality, which is like, can you use induction to prove that induction works? That's just one thought too many. It just is. Just rationality is just a tool we use, full stop. You don't need to go one step further to explain rationality. And I sometimes wonder if consciousness is like that. It just is. Full stop.
Yeah, it's not clear. I'm skeptical of near-term solutions, but there are a lot of philosophers, definitely smarter guys than me, who think that maybe there's ways to have traction on this. So Thomas Nagel himself, for example, mentioned something I think called objective phenomenology, which is basically the idea of like, if you can really study subjective experience and all the ways that it feels like to be a human, all the ways like the differences and variations between experiences, and you look into their structure, maybe you'd be able to glean something from that in a way that would be informative about how brains are associated with subjective experience. And there's a lot of people working on that sort of project at the moment, and I hope it succeeds, but I certainly don't think there's any guarantee.
And you're familiar with Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's theory of the ORCHOR microtubules. So, what do you make of that?
I don't think it adds a whole bunch of explanatory power. If you were to say that, like, deep down, human brains can do something different to what Turing machines can do, what computers can do, and that's based in, like, being able to affect quantum collapse, or I forget the exact details of their theory, that somehow is what explains subjective experience. I don't really follow the logic there of why we need to be invoking quantum mechanical properties to explain conscious experience. It seems like even if it were the case that effects in microtubules, tiny structural components of neurons, were involved in consciousness, you'd still have the hard problem. It'd just be, you'd know that phenomenon was associated, but it wouldn't explain why a particular kind of quantum collapse leads to redness as opposed to blueness or greenness or something. But also most neuroscientists are quite skeptical that both that the quantum effects happen at the scale that they claim would be required, and that even if they are happening, that really explains anything.
Yeah. almost like quantum physics is spooky and weird, and consciousness is spooky and weird. So somehow they must be connected.
Yeah,
because
that joke's been made many times.
I guess the connection is that information appears to be transferred across any distance. Could be across the room, across the Milky Way galaxy, instantaneously with the two-slit experiment, and all that. And even quantum physicists go, yeah, it's really weird. Okay. And that it feels like, well, maybe the information in my brain could do the same kind of thing and go transfer over to your brain or to some soul place in quantum ether or something like that. But here we're just using words, right? But it's what would be the mechanism exactly? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unimpressive things about the human brain as well, to be honest. Like, our reaction times are actually pretty slow in comparison to like what computers can do. Our like random memory, our calculation abilities, like a calculator is way better than my brain is. So we do a lot of impressive things, but we do a lot of things badly as well. And it doesn't seem like they're doing quantum magic that gives us extremely impressive abilities. It's just, as you say, like there's weird stuff like explaining consciousness or sometimes leaps of insight. So I think Penrose was first inspired by the fact that he thought that mathematicians could do stuff that computers just couldn't do. But as a non-mathematician myself, I'm not in a good position to judge whether that's true or not.
All right, remind our listeners why we're talking about this, because if we want to upload the mind or live forever, or for yourself to continue beyond the death of the body, what are we even talking about? Your consciousness and then yourself. So let's talk about that. Who am I? What does that mean to say I'm a self? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think there's actually two different aspects to this that often get confused in this discussion that I want to pull apart from each other. So very briefly, the argument I make in the book is that people depend, like a person's ongoing survival depends on the structure of their brain. We have ways of taking terminally ill people, preserving their brains in very high quality, with the hope that at some point in the future, medical science will advance to the point where they could be revived and restored to health. That's the argument in brief. But as part of that, you have to ask, like, would that be me that would be restored, even if you could do it? Or would that be something else? Or what am I what is it to be a person, a subjective experience, that sort of thing? And there's two key aspects to that. One is, what am I in the moment? So when I'm having this subjective experience right now, when I'm conscious, like, how does that work? How does my brain give rise to consciousness? The second part is, what is it to be a person across time, through things like breaks in the continuity of consciousness, through things like changes to our physical bodies? And that's the question of personal identity. What makes someone the same person at different time points? And the reason why I highlight that those are different is because, primarily because although, like, whenever I'm talking and feeling things, I'm conscious at that point in time, I'm fairly certain I can survive periods of time when I'm not conscious for a while. So when I'm asleep, I'm probably not conscious. When I'm under anesthesia, there's even stronger evidence that I'm not conscious. And there's even some procedures involving inducing hypothermia in individuals, where you can see that for a while, surgeons can have someone's brain activity stop, their heart activity stop. You cool them down to 18 degrees, and they still have something like a 60-minute operating window in which they can then warm the patient back up again. Their brain activity is restored, and they go back to consciousness. So that's why I see the two issues as different. What is it to be me in the moment consciously? And then how do I survive over decades, years, that sort of thing, personal identity.
Right. So you have your moment to moment, seeing the world through your eyes, your point of view self, that is broken in sleep a little bit, but you dream and you wake up and it comes back online, and it's broken in general anesthesia or in the surgery you talk about. And on that latter one where you're cooling the brain and body down, is it low enough that the brain neurons, they're not firing anymore?
Correct.
So
yeah,
if the memories come back online, then the memories were not just a process. They're stored permanently in some physical structure. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's actually a lot of different kinds of memory. We talk about memory in broad brush, but there's things like long-term memory. So remembering where you went to school or your childhood home. Those are really long-term. And those are stored differently from things like short-term memory, what you had for breakfast this morning, or even working memory, which is when you're like rehearsing a phone number so you can keep it in your head, or a Wi-Fi password. Now, working memory definitely depends on ongoing electrical activity in your brain. And if you knock that out, then you'll lose probably at least the last, minute of memory or so, and maybe a whole chunk of your short-term memory. But those long-term memories, those things that happened to you years and decades ago, there's very strong evidence that that's just structural. The examples, as I was talking about in the hypothermia case, which is where, there's no electrical activity in those neurons once you're cooled to that level, but the structures remain. And as a result of those structures still being there, the memories are retained. There's other examples that are being done at the moment in manipulating animal models of memory, messing around with the circuitry of their brains that show that you can mess around with their long-term memories through manipulating these structures. And similarly, there's other evidence that if you knock out some electrical activity or some short-term changes in the ways that the rodents are synthesizing molecules, that you can disrupt the short-term memories without the long-term memory. Sorry.
Gotcha. Okay. So the idea of preserving yourself indefinitely into the future through cryonics or brain preservation or vitrification or whatever is that you really want to restore the long-term memories, because that's how I really define myself in a kind of a fuzzy set. So let's think about that for a second. Now, I always like Wittgenstein's discussion of language and concepts, like what is a game? Give me the exact correct definition of a game and I'll find you 20 exceptions, right? But at some point we go, yeah, I know there's these, but that, roughly speaking, these are games, right? And I think of, myself, well, I'm this and that, and I could lose some parts of this and that. I could forget my password, whatever. I'm still me. But at some point, like your discussion of Phineas Gage, where his friends go, he's no longer Gage, or, the spouse of a Alzheimer's a victim who just says, well, she's just not who she used to be. And at some point it's like 80%, 60%, 40%, 20% remains of the memories. And then the self is gone. I guess you just have to draw the line somewhere, but I'm not sure how to do that.
Yeah. Let's spend a moment then on what is the self. What is the thing that, exists at different time points that is bound together, that forms personal identity across time. So in any particular moment, there's a question of apart from consciousness, what are the other things that comprise the self? And again, it's contentious philosophy, many different theories that people have. But one of the most common ones, and one of the oldest theories, is something that William James described as the multiple attributes theory of the self. So it's the idea that we are defined by basically every aspect of ourselves that we deem important. And there's a range of importance. So the most key things are our memories, our personality, our goals and desires, our deepest dreams. But then there's things like our embodied self. So that I have arms and legs and a head and the particular height and body that I have. And then there's things even more distant, like our social relationships, our culture, our friends, our family, all the way down to our possessions. And what's interesting is James described this, I think, in the late 19th century or maybe very early 20th century. But if you do some experimental philosophy work, if you actually survey hundreds of people on what they think is most important for the self, they give you a pretty similar list of attributes where they say, memories, brain, personality, those things are really important. If you damage those, as in the case of Phineas Gage, an unfortunate man who had a railroad spike go through part of his brain, then there's a real question of is that still the same self? Is that still the same person? As opposed to, if your car gets totaled, that's very frustrating, and maybe you really like that car and it was part of your identity, but there's not really damage to yourself in the same way. So then the argument is, if you can hold on to those psychological things, maybe you can hold on to the self. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And then with embodied cognition here, I'm just thinking about the cryonics people that just have their heads frozen because it's cheaper. Wouldn't you really need to have your whole body? Because that's also you are your body. You're not just your head.
Yeah, I think we think about the self as very well defined, and we think about personal identity as often very discrete. It's either me or it's not me. But I'd say there's a little bit of fuzziness. So for example, when somebody gets their colon removed because they have Crohn's disease or colorectal cancer, that is damage to the person and damage to the self. But we don't normally think about that turning them into a completely different person. More dramatically, if you have a spinal cord injury and you become quadriplegic, that's a pretty big change to someone's body. But still, we think of that as a harm to them, but not really they become a completely different person. And I would say that the functions of the brain, personality, memories, all those things are so important. They really capture most of what matters about an individual, to the extent that I would say that if you hold on to those, you've still held on to someone. But that's not to say the other embodied parts aren't important, and particularly the way that they move and interface and sense the world isn't important. So you definitely want to hold on to as much of that as possible under any proposal for reviving people.
Yeah. So death then would be defined in your system as the loss of the information that represents you.
That's right. Maybe if you'll indulge me, a very brief historical overview I think is helpful for people. So again, it seems often like what death is should be like very well defined, and doctors always know exactly where the line is, and like this isn't an area of contention. But when you get into the literature, it's actually quite fuzzy. And what's fascinating is the definition of death has changed over time that people have been using. So prior to the middle of the 20th century, there was essentially no better definition than somebody stopped breathing, because at that point, there wasn't anything you could do for someone. But with the invention of things like mechanical ventilators to help people when their lungs fail, or cardiopulmonary bypass machines to circulate their blood even when their heart had stopped for a while, people realized that we kind of needed a more sophisticated definition of death. So in the 1970s, in the US in particular, doctors and ethicists and legislators worked on something called the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which was a new formal definition of death based on two components. One was the irreversible cessation of all heart and lung functions. And two was, the irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain. That is now the new definition of death that was used, and in particular, that second part, the irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain, is what we think of as brain death these days. Now, that was certainly a better definition than what existed before, but issues became apparent basically immediately. The first part of the definition, the loss of heart and lung functions, was already kind of dubious based on heart and lung machines existing. And particularly today, we have things like extracorporeal membrane oxygenation machines, ECMO, which are devices that can essentially fully substitute for someone's heart and lungs for a period of days to weeks. They take someone's blood out, filter it, remove carbon dioxide, introduce oxygen, return it back into the patient. So nobody really in a philosophical sense thinks someone depends on their heart and lungs these days. So nowadays we focus on the brain death side, but there's two big issues with the definition based on irreversible loss of all brain functions. One is that if you actually look inside the brains of people who are declared brain dead but kept on life support, you'll often still see bits of brain function remaining in those patients. So, for example, their hypothalamus, a brain region controlling things like body temperature, is often still functioning. Doctors just don't think it matters. Like, they don't think it's a core part of someone's self. So they're like, well, that doesn't count. We'll declare them dead anyway. I'm not saying that's inappropriate, but I'm just saying it's in tension with the definition of death. The second part is the irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain. Because what counts as irreversible cessation depends on the technology that you have around at the time, where things that at one point might be irreversible increasingly might become reversible. So in the same way that things like heart and lung machines got really good, nowadays we see the first baby steps of brain implants getting better and better, whether that's crude things like deep brain stimulators, which can help people with Parkinson's disease or other traumatic brain injuries, whether it's newer things like the new Neuralink implants, which can help people with spinal cord injuries control computer mice and other stuff. And we can look to the future at how these are going to get better and better. So when you look to the future and you're like, wow, what if we had really good brain implants? What point would a person die if we can always reverse lost brain functions? It seems to me, and also other philosophers, that a good case to be made is that, well, it's when you lose the things that can't be replaced. Your memories, your personality, the unique psychological properties that make you compared to someone else, that a person has died. And that's defining death as irreversible loss of personal identity, focusing on those psychological things. That's the argument I make.
Yeah, it's a good argument. I mean, if you ask most people, I think there's actually surveys on this, if you could be brought back to life 1,000 years from now, but you wouldn't know it's you, but you get to still be alive, would you want to do it? It'd be like, well, it wouldn't be me. I mean, what would be the point? I mean, there will
There's
be
quite a
people alive 1,000 years from now. They just won't be me. So what's the difference?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of surveys on this sort of stuff, both in favor of people really focusing on like the psychological properties of what makes me me. You see, for example, surveys where patients' relatives are asked, has the patient's identity been damaged? And if it's mobility issues, then they're like, obviously it's still my husband, wife, father, whatever. Like, why are you even asking? But if it's things, as you mentioned, like severe brain damage, then those questions start to come up. So I agree.
Yeah. I like your discussion of the surveys on, how long would you like to live? And most people give pretty much whatever the average lifespan is for their generation, and maybe a little more, right? But if you fast forward to the day before, you're up tomorrow. Would you like another month? Yeah, I'd like another month. And then the 30 days goes by. Oh, I'll take another year, thank you. So
Yeah,
it's really hard to know what people are really thinking on these questions.
of course. You always, I mean, as someone who runs psychology experiments, I am aware that the exact wording of the questions, surveys, context, everything matters. On a Skeptic show, which you run,
Yeah.
I think it's good to note that like always you've got to be skeptical of study design and construction and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, it's just let's think about a couple other weird things here. I mean, how do we even know we're going to die? And who were the first humans who realized this? Like, oh my God, I just realized. There's everybody around me that's older than me is dead, and there they are in the grave or whatever. I guess this is going to happen to me. And why don't elephants and chimps and gorillas know this, or do they? I mean, it's kind of an interesting subject about awareness of one's mortality.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly not a zoologist, so I don't know what the elephants and chimps do. I think there's some evidence that other animals mourn their dead. So
They
maybe they
grieve,
have
yes.
some.
They mourn and grieve. Well, they express behavior that looks like it. They kind of mope
Yeah,
around and they poke at the dead body, or the mother carries the baby around for weeks after its death. It's hard to know. Again, it's the problem of what other
yeah,
people,
of course.
other minds. I don't know for sure.
But you alluded to the surveys of how long people want to live, and I think that's just a point. So the motivation for me writing this book about how it is we might be able to preserve the terminally ill and restore them to health in the future is motivated by that sort of data. So I think most people don't think about death that much. They try and avoid thinking about it. And they might have a sense when they're younger that like, oh, I guess when I get older, like I might accept it. It seems natural. Everyone dies. That's just what happens. So when you run surveys and you ask younger people, as you said, they typically say they'd like to live maybe a typical life expectancy plus 10 years. So maybe 90 or something in a developed country. But as people get older, the number gets bumped up. And when you survey the actually terminally ill, those in hospices, those at death's door, what you normally see is they still show a very strong will to live. So something like 70% of surveyed patients in one study still, as they were imminently dying, said that if only they could continue, then they would want to. And I guess we're going to get into probably the like crazy aspects of my book, but that's the key thing I'd like people to keep in mind is that even if they don't buy any of the arguments I'm making, there's still, on the basis of that alone, good reasons to be investing more in anti-aging medicine, life extension medicine, anything we can do to possibly help people at that point.
Oh, for sure. I mean, let's just start with just extending life through small changes here and there. I mean, you've already mentioned a few with the brain chips that help, cochlear implants and things like that. So why not just keep going? And the thought experiment of it from it to bit, where you just replace each neuron, while you're asleep or whatever, and you would never even know it. There would just be a continuation. Well, that's pure science fiction, but in principle, I mean, maybe 500 years from now, of 500 years of neuroscience development and more Elons doing their thing, changing the world with Neuralink type companies, it's conceivable to get there. Surely somebody who's on death's door would go, yeah, okay, I'll just put the extra little chip in my memory banks there, whatever, the prefrontal cortex or the hippocampus or something, and restore my memories. Yeah, I would like that. That seems reasonable, just step by step, incremental improvements.
So yeah, that's the idea of gradual replacement of brain materials of neurons with replacement components. I guess to take a step back, I feel like the ideal life extension technology, right, would be some pill that we take that just stops us from aging. Either it halts it or it reverses it to, I don't know, 25, 30, whatever age you feel like being. And then you just don't get sick, you don't get hurt, everything's perfect from then onwards. Maybe you can change your body if you want to, but otherwise it's just perfectly healthy for forever. Like, that is also the ideal that I wish could exist. I just don't see that happening anytime soon. There is some effort being put into anti-aging medicine, and I very much hope it succeeds, but I'm skeptical that for many people alive today, it will be fast enough. And that's the issue I see, that we have, something like 60 million people dying a year globally, and that's just going to continue until such time as we either develop the technology to solve it or we wipe ourselves out as a species. So I'm like, what can we do for people in the meantime? And again, maybe it would be nicer if we didn't have an anti-aging pill, but maybe we could do gradual replacement of components as they fail. That would be nice. But again, I don't think we can do that either. We don't have the technology at the moment to provide that to people. Our implants and prosthetics are very crude, and they only help with small, well-defined injuries at this point in time. So as weird as it sounds, I do think the brain preservation option that I advocate for is the most viable method that has actually some good philosophical and scientific grounding in why it might work for those who are at death's door at present, even if at some point in the future, hopefully we'll have better techniques.
So this is the restoring the connectome, the synaptic connection map that represents your memories, and therefore that's you. Am I saying that right?
Yeah. Maybe I'll make the argument very explicit. So the idea is, I'm saying that what makes someone the same person over time is the structure of their brain that holds on to their memories, their personality, all those psychological properties. The full collection of your neurons and those connections between the neurons, those synapses, is termed someone's connectome, as a homage to how a full set of someone's genes is their genome. And the argument I make is that because it's that matters, that even if you need to put someone in a state of stasis where they're unconscious for an extended period of time, then they can survive, as they do in the induced hypothermia or anesthesia. And even if you then restore them to consciousness in some weird way in the future, as long as you hold on to that information, it's still them. In the same way that we survive normally the physical replacement of our body, where, for example, we replace our skin every month, our blood every few months, and even the components that make up our brain get replaced every few months as well. So yeah, my argument is that if in the future you could restore someone to consciousness by taking their connectome and doing something with it, of which I think actually, and this is also going to sound science fiction, but the most viable extrapolation from current technology would be something like uploading the individual. I think that would count as genuine survival of me in the same way that I survive over days, months, and years at the moment.
Okay, so let me give you my thought experiment on this. We slide you, Ariel, into a fancy fMRI brain scanner. We scan your connectome. We can't do this yet, but let's say we could. And then I slide you out, and we have the complete digital file of all your memories, and we upload it in the cloud. And I go, hey, Ariel, you're up there now. And you're standing there going, no, I'm not. I'm right here. That's just a copy of me. So at that point, would you say that the definition of the self has to change? You can have two of you.
No, so this is why I distinguished before between consciousness in the moment and personal identity, what makes someone exist over time. Because I agree this is a very unsettling and unintuitive thought experiment, but it's good at getting at the difference between these. So naturally, we are not... we don't have the same issues arise when we think about how we as individuals can be in different places at different times. So I'm going to be here talking to you right now. In 2 hours from now, I might be at the gym or the supermarket or something. So that's, two different experiences in two different locations. But that seems okay because it's not simultaneously two experiences in different places. What you're describing is unintuitive because you could have a circumstance where I could look at another conscious entity and be like, but that's not my consciousness that's going on there. But what I would say is that if you think through what it is that makes someone survive over time, and you realize that it can't just be that you're made of the same body because that gets replaced and that's okay. It can't be a continuous stream of consciousness because we can survive breaks in consciousness that's okay. Then the only thing you're left with is the continuation and maintenance of these psychological properties. And so the same thing that means that I can exist here now and somewhere else in a day, a week, a year from now, does imply that if you had two consciousnesses, but with the same psychological properties, all the same memories, all of those things, then I really could be in two different places at once, which is bizarre. And I agree, unintuitive, but I think the most acceptable outcome of thinking through this process. But I'm sure you'll push me on it, so go for it.
Well, but so the copy of you would also think it's you, as would you. So
yeah, I would say they're both me. Not the same subjective experience, but they are both me, as in Ariel Zeleznikow-Johnston, a person who exists across time.
But then that very moment when the split happens, you would have slightly different life experiences in the same way that identical twins do. And they're not the same at that point because they have different life experiences. And then from there on, it would just branch out.
Yeah, so I'd say there's a fuzzy line where for a long time, much of the same psychological character would exist in both copies, making them the same person. You could imagine that if a sufficient amount of difference accumulated, so if they really had very different memories, very different personalities, then they would become two different people. But I would argue, at least for a substantial period of time, they would be the same person. In the same way that I can survive the accumulation of new memories ordinarily, or slight changes in my personality or changes in my taste. I don't think I become a new person if I spend another week on a holiday, or if I develop a preference for a new genre of music. Like, small changes are survivable.
Yeah, there was a Star Trek Next Generation episode where the Enterprise goes to some planet and they beam down, and Riker sees a copy of himself that, like 12 years earlier, was accidentally duplicated in the transporter. But he doesn't. But they're two different people now, because it's been 12 years of 12 years of different experiences, and so they're really different people. It's at what point would they become different in your model?
I think sadly it's sort of a fuzzy boundary, and we'd have to ask people and survey people. I'm not sure there's a sharp line carved into reality to define where that point is. In the same way that I think if somebody just gets a mild concussion, then they've suffered an injury, but they're still the same person. If somebody's had extreme brain damage to the point where they're barely conscious, or they have very dramatic personality changes, as with Gage, then it's questionable whether they are the same person. But between the two, it's just kind of fuzzy. And I guess it's either up to each individual or society in general to come up with a line that they want to use, or a fuzzy boundary. But I don't have a very sharp answer as to, it's the same person for 6 months, but different after 10 years or something.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But if it was not cryonically frozen and brought back online somehow, it was a digital file put on an AI system. So I guess you would say that it's substrate independent. It doesn't matter what the material is, as long as the pattern is continuous.
Yeah. So obviously this ends up mattering on what the nature of consciousness, the physical basis of consciousness, turns out to be. Where I'd say that you can hold on to personal identity if you can hold on to those memories, personality, whatever, even if it's in a digital format. But when you're then restoring someone to consciousness, then you want to make sure that they're actually conscious and not a philosophical zombie or something at that point in time, which I think constrains the ways in which you'd restore someone to consciousness. Ideally, even if you were using different materials, you'd get it as close to the original biological brain. So you might talk about something like a whole brain emulation, which is different from a simulation. An emulation actually recreates the same causal mechanisms as the original entity. So something like that, I'd be more comfortable would probably work. And I think most philosophers and neuroscientists would be more comfortable. The more distant it gets from that, if it's just like an LLM, large language model, trained on your like corpus of works, I'd be more dubious that that's a successful mechanism, even if it replicated someone's behavior to a degree.
Well, even a lot of the SETI scientists and others that think about extraterrestrials, if we encounter aliens, they're not going to be biological beings. They'll be something like computers or AI memories of the beings that sent the robots out into space, that kind of thing. So, I think you could be comfortable with that idea of the continuation of it. But at some point, because we're embodied beings for billions of years of evolution, every organism has a body of some kind. Wouldn't you want to be transported back into something like a biological body.
Yeah, I was perhaps a little dismissive of embodied cognition before when I was talking about how it's the brain that really matters, but I shouldn't be too dismissive. Like, I think the ways in which we have our sensory inputs and the ways in which we have our motor outputs are extremely important for how we function. And indeed, you have a lot of neuroscientists who think that the key thing that a brain does is predict future sensory inputs and future motor outputs, and that without inputs and outputs, then it just wouldn't work, or it'd work very differently. That's not to say, though, that it has to be done in a traditional biological sense. In the same way that we have increasingly better prosthetics today, you can imagine having a robotic body instead if it worked well enough. Maybe even a virtual body, as long as the virtual world and the virtual body was set up in the same way that someone's original biological body was. So I'm not so like it has to be traditional biology, but I do think you'd need to have some sort of embodiment in some format to feel like you were restored to health.
Well, so this is one thing I like about cryonics. I'm not signed up yet. I'm hoping they give me a free freeze. But as I understand it, it's not that expensive because you buy an insurance policy, and Alcor or whatever the company is the recipient of the beneficiary of the policy when it goes off. So you spend maybe $1,000 a year or something on premiums, and pays off at $250,000 or whatever it costs to have your whole body frozen. I would want the whole body. My sense about cryonics, I don't think they're there yet, but you can bring us up to speed in a second, is that it would just be like a long sleep or anesthesia, general anesthesia. I would just wake up. It doesn't matter how long it is from now. So how close are we being able to do, I think you mentioned there's 1,000 bodies frozen now. A lot of them were frozen before the cryoprotectants were put in, so they're probably never going to be revived, but maybe some of the people that are recently frozen will be revived. What are your thoughts on that? What's the current science on all that?
All right, let's talk about techniques. So I mentioned before the ideal would be an anti-aging pill. We don't have that. Next best, I think, would be something like a time machine, where we take the terminally ill and we just throw them 100 years into the future, the hope that medicine would be able to improve them there, and they just don't experience any decay in the meantime. They're just like, well, here one moment, gone the next, into hopefully a world with better technology. But we also don't have time machines, so I can't advocate for that. So the next best thing is being able to preserve someone's body as close to as what they were like prior to the preservation procedure in a way that stops them from decaying or being damaged in any way, that holds on to the structures of their brain and their biology, all of those things. So the most naive idea that one could have for how to do this would just be to freeze someone, to cool them down, no other application, straight freeze, same thing we do for food in freezers. Now that preserves things a little bit, but the issue is that if you freeze biological material, you get ice formation, the water expands, that punctures cells, does a whole bunch of damage. It's no good for maintaining the biological viability of any non-trivial size thing. So what developed, I forget the exact dates actually, but later in the 20th century, was an improved process called vitrification, which was the idea of adding some antifreeze or some cryoprotectants to biological material prior to cooling it down. And then as it got colder, instead of just freezing, it would just solidify, but not as ice, just as a solid. And with that method, you have much better preservation. That's what's used, for example, at the moment to store things like eggs and sperm and embryos for IVF procedures. It's used routinely very well. Sometimes we can even pull embryos out after decades and they still lead to successful pregnancies. The issue with vitrification, though, is that it doesn't scale very well to larger organs and whole humans because the chemicals used, these cryoprotectants, they're both a little bit toxic in and of themselves, but the bigger issue is that they cause dehydration. They're very viscous, they pull water out of biological materials. So it's okay on small things like an embryo, but if you get to a whole organ or brain, you start to see shrinkage and shriveling of that material. So for example, you mentioned Alcor and their preserved patients who are preserved using vitrification as opposed to straight freezing. Certainly they're preserved better than the people who are just frozen. But if you look in their brains, what you'll see is like a shriveling of 50%. So their brains are shrunk in half compared to what they were like prior to their vitrification procedure, which is like, I'm not saying that definitely means that the connectome is destroyed and someone's memories and personality in there is gone, but it's not a good sign for a good preservation technique that you'd want to keep things identical to prior to the procedure.
Okay, hang on one second. If you're stopping all molecular motion, why is it shrinking?
Because essentially the shrinking happens before all molecular motion stops.
Oh, I see.
So
Okay.
you add the cryoprotectant in while someone's still warmer, and the fluid, like the water, gets pulled out during the cooling process. Then once it gets cold enough, it stops. But the issue is that like large pieces of tissue, like a whole body, you can't just instantly freeze it all the way in. So if you just like dunk them in liquid nitrogen, the outside would freeze, but the inside would still decay for a while. That's why they add the cryoprotectants, but they can't get everywhere all at once. And so there's dehydration in the meantime.
Right.
So,
and a technical question. Legally, these companies can only do this after the person has been declared officially dead by like a physician or something?
So currently people are still using the legal definition of death I mentioned before, based on irreversible cessation of the heart or irreversible cessation of all brain functions. Practically, most doctors will use the irreversible cessation of the heart one, because particularly if someone's obviously dying anyway, that's the like clear marker that they use for diagnostic criteria. So they can only commence after the heart stops. This is an aside from what we were talking about, but it means that ideally these sorts of procedures happen somewhere where people can use something like medical assistance in dying, or where they have sudden cardiac arrests. It's a bit problematic if it's someone who's experienced a very long dying process where a lot of damage has been happening to their brain and body prior to their heart finally giving out. But to jump back, I was talking about vitrification and how it causes dehydration, and that's not ideal for having a good, high-quality preservation of something like a brain. So this problem led some neuroscientists to say, look, the techniques that Alcor are proposing, like, they're not good enough. We want better techniques that preserve brains in a way that looks more like brains do when they're still biologically active. And so on the basis of groups like the Brain Preservation Foundation promoting a prize for people to come up with better techniques, one group came up with something called aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation, or it's basically fixation. So the idea with this process is prior to cooling someone down and adding the antifreeze, you do an initial step called fixation, where you introduce preservative chemicals, aldehydes, into the bloodstream, the blood vessels of an animal, a human, whatever. And what that does is it locks everything in place. It penetrates their whole body, permeates everywhere, gets into their brain, and essentially fixes everything in place, stops any further biological movement or decay. And then afterwards, you can cool them down to stop any other, maybe possibly remaining processes, and you don't see that shrinkage issue. If you then image the brain, it looks essentially the same as it did prior to preservation step. So that, I think, is the best preservation technique we have at the moment, this aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation or fixation technique.
Yeah. So, and there again, it's based on the idea that memories, the ones we care about that define ourselves, are fixed. And therefore,
yes.
So then the next step is, how do you turn it back on?
Indeed. So yeah, this is the hard part, right? So the weird thing about this technology is the argument is it comes in two parts. The first part is the initial preservation and storage, which we're saying, actually, we can do that today. And the second part is the revival, which we're saying, look, can't do this today, but we promise there's a good chance that we should be able to do that in the future. And obviously that's always, people should be dubious of things where you're saying, oh, we promise we might be able to do this in the future. And mostly for most science, we want to see the whole story before we're like, actually, yeah, it's going to work, before we buy into it. But what's different in this circumstance is people are dying in the meantime. And I think the fact that we'd like to be able to do something for those, if we can, should prompt us to be like, okay, let's scrutinize this weird idea of maybe we can revive people in the future, but we shouldn't totally dismiss it out of hand. Because if there's some credible chance it could work, then let's consider it. And so, yes, how could you revive someone from preservation? So the most viable method, I think, that will probably exist, and the one that's the most straightforward extrapolation of technology we're already developing today, is the idea of uploading someone whose brain has been preserved. What that would practically entail is taking their preserved brain, scanning it at very high resolution, so almost down to the molecular level, with either something like electron microscopy or there's some newer techniques called expansion microscopy that are also being developed. And then once you collect all of that information, synthesizing it back into, a digital version of someone's connectome. So all of the connections between neurons, what kind of neuron they were they dopaminergic or glutamatergic or serotonergic, whatever. All of that important information, putting it into some digital format where you can then allow it to run again, where you can produce what's called an emulation, where the same causal mechanisms that neurons use, they're, how they sum the inputs coming from neurons they're connected to and decide whether they want to send a signal out to the neurons that they upstream of. Those same processes can be recreated in a digital format. And then that happens either in a robotic brain, a digital brain, conceivably maybe even a stem cell grown brain, but that seems harder to do. But let's say a robotic brain. And then through doing that, you would restore someone to consciousness with their memories and personality and all that sort of stuff intact. That's the argument I would be making.
Yes, okay. So by analogy, if you have a digital file representing your genome, how would you put that into a biological system or any kind of physical system to turn on to do what genes do? And by analogy, that's what you have to do for the connectome.
Indeed. So the question is, at what scale or what level of physical process is relevant for capturing what matters for what we're concerned by? Now, with genes, the relevant scale is, the level of nucleotides of molecular interactions. Because we talk about genetic code and A's and T's and G's and C's, but that's a simplification of what's actually happening inside your cells, where you actually have these DNA strands that are intertwining and interacting with mRNA molecules and interacting with all sorts of molecules in the environment and folding themselves. And so I would say that a perfect emulation of someone's genome would essentially have to capture their what's happening inside their cells down at this basically atomic level. Maybe not all the way down to what's happening in the quarks inside the atoms, or maybe not even the quantum level, although I suspect quantum effects might be relevant for genes. So there is a scale below which could be neglected, but it would be a pretty low level that you'd need to have an emulation of someone's genetics. The hope is that human brains actually operate at a notably higher level. Maybe the lowest level is of ion channels, so levels like proteins, which are a higher scale than atoms, but quite possibly at a higher level still of population activity of neurons, of whole circuits. And evidence in favor of that is, for example, there was the recent publication of the entire connectome of a fly brain, where they'd scanned all of its 160,000 neurons, all the connections between those neurons. And not only did they perform these scans, they also created a digital version of this fly brain, of its connectome, to the extent that when they stimulated this model's sensory neurons for taste, it's sugary tasting neurons, it tried to send motor outputs to stick out its proboscis, to stick out its tongue. And this was a relatively crude model. It definitely didn't capture the full depth of what actual neurons do. It was a simplification. But even in this model, it showed some of the functional properties of what brains do, which is an argument that actually maybe the relevant scale is something we could get a grip on. Much more complicated than what today's computers and machines could do, but not forever inconceivable.
Yes, okay, so let's think about what a neuron has an action potential. It fires, and its cell walls become semi-permeable, and it exchanges potassium and sodium. It's been a long time since I read about this.
No, that's
down the axon to the little buds at the end where the synaptic connections are to the next neuron, and so on. You would not need to replicate every single ion, sodium and potassium and so on, all the way down. You just need to know it just did this thing. It had an action potential. You just need to replicate that.
Yeah, you could imagine the nicest version, if it turns out that brains are actually quite, forgiving in their complexity, would be you'd have a graph network where each neuron maybe you could model as a single point, and you'd need to have a set of connections between each neuron, and you'd say okay, if there's an action potential in this one, that gives a little downstream signal to all these other ones that are next in nodes in the graph. It's likely that it's not that simple, because we know neurons are actually more complicated than single points. you might have to do something like model each neuron as 10,000 different compartments, each doing their own little calculations, which is a lot more complex than single points, but it's still nowhere near the level of like the giant septillions or whatever number of actual ions that are present in each neuron.
Yeah. But again, like your definition of the self, you just kind of need a fuzzy set to get a rough estimate of what's going on, to kind of get a replication where the person feels like, yeah, that's me. I have a memory. Like those experiments done last year, whenever it was, where they could image what the brain was seeing just based on the brain scans, right? It was it was kind of like a tree or something like that. You could kind of roughly see what the monkey was seeing.
Those are decoding from like recordings of visual cortex, where you can like take scans of visual cortex and have a good guess at what the monkey's actually experiencing.
That's pretty good for your theory, right?
Yeah, well, so this is the point that I think a lot of neuroscientists make, where it really seems that over time, neuroscience is converging on the idea that it is the structure of the brain that gives us cognitive processes, memory, these sorts of things. Like the argument for it being based on a soul seems to be getting weaker and weaker over time, I would say.
Yes, sure.
And it seems like the forward trajectory is like maybe a whole brain emulation would actually work at some point. And there's interim steps you can imagine where you'd want to be able to show memory extraction from a preserved brain. You'd want to be able to demonstrate all of this with a simple animal to show that, if you had a mouse that you trained to run through a maze and then you preserved its brain and you created an emulation of it, that version of the mouse could navigate the maze, whereas a naively emulated mouse couldn't get through the maze. There's all these steps along the way. And if those fail, then my argument starts to become more and more dubious, and maybe this won't work. But if we see that continuation, then we have reasons to think something like it could work. And indeed, I actually ran a survey with some colleagues of neuroscientists recently, where we got a few hundred neuroscientist responses from a random sample, not just like my weird brain preservation friends from conference abstracts. And we saw that we asked a couple of questions. We asked, do you think we could ever extract memories from preserved brains? And we asked, do you ever think we could ever create a whole brain emulation of a preserved brain in a way that restored an animal's like long-term behavior functions? And there was a huge variability in people's responses. It was some people like definitely yes, some people were like absolutely not. But the median response people gave was about 40% probability that it would work. Now that's not 100%, so people should be somewhat skeptical of what I'm saying, but it's a far cry from 0.001%. That's a substantial probability.
Yeah. I like those surveys. I've read David Shermer. He's done 2 of those surveys on all the big questions in philosophy, where you have like 3,500 professional philosophers and graduate students recording their positions on 27 different philosophical debates. So but I'm curious about that in terms of like a philosophy of science question. If 60% of philosophers are compatibilists and 20% are determinists and the rest are libertarian free will people, what does that mean? Exactly. Like there's never going to be consensus.
No, I mean, obviously surveys are no substitute for actual philosophical proofs or scientific experiments, and science is littered with examples of one person being right and millions of being wrong. So it's not the same level of evidence by any means. I think I more use it as a point where if you want to have a sense of what a community takes seriously or thinks is worth investigating or thinks is possible at all, then I'd be very reticent to dismiss anything that has any non-trivial amount of support from a community as like not even worthy of investigation. And I ran this survey because I wanted to see whether there was any non-trivial support for the possibility of preservation.
Interesting.
As an example.
Yeah. Oh, this is wild stuff, Ariel. Sometimes I feel like Dr. McCoy. I don't want to get in the transporter and move my pattern over to some other planet. I'd rather be frozen because at least I feel like I'm still, a physical structure. If you could just solve the problem of defrosting me and with things still intact, so I don't look like frozen strawberries that are defrosted.
Yeah.
But then what? It's like you talk about vitalism. Before we got a better understanding of how the body works. Again, it's like that, and then a miracle happens, and the thing is alive. Well, what's that step there? Here it's a chemical process. It's autocatalytic or whatever. Oh, okay. So we don't have the elan vital necessary anymore, and probably we don't need that for the mind either. But then what? So here I'm thinking of, Dr. Frankenstein and when Mary Shelley wrote that book, electricity was all the rage, right? So in the movie, Dr. Frankenstein sends the monster up on the hoist up to the top where the electric storm zaps him. It kind of seems like, since neurons are electrical in nature, at least how you record them, it would be something like having to do that, give it a spark, almost like the jump starting the heart kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, in emulation, you'd need its memory states to be able to vary. So it needs to be able to send signals, change its activity dynamically. Like how it is that that's associated with consciousness, we don't have a theory of consciousness yet, but we know that if you turn electrical activity off, people lose behavior and they seem to be unconscious. And if you then warm someone up, restore them to consciousness, remove anesthesia, whatever, and the neurons can change their activity states, they seem to be conscious again. So definitely you need that sort of variation.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to jump on, though, you mentioned your uncomfortableness with getting in the transporter. And while I was saying before that I think someone, as weird as it is, could be in two different places at once through some sort of teleporter like that, I don't want to dismiss people's concerns that it feels like it wouldn't be them, or, if you killed one of the two branches, that something bad wouldn't have happened. I would just say that what I think the harm has been done is slightly different from what people's initial intuition might be. So I think most people think that you have killed a person in that circumstance. And that I would disagree with, because I think as long as the psychological properties, memories, personality continues in at least one of the branches, the person hasn't died. But I think the harm that has been done is the conscious being who you've just killed, their experiences and their memories have been erased from that person, because now there's a branch that's just been wiped out. It's sort of analogous to, if you imagine you took those two branches, but instead you put them within one person. And what you did is at some point you took me and you gave me an amnestic drug, something that knocked out my memory. And you said, I'm going to wipe out the past hour, day, week, year from your life. That wouldn't be quite the same as killing me, but it would definitely be doing a lot of harm to me. And I think that's the intuition that I have and that many other people have as well, where it's still bad to do that. Yeah. But it's not quite the same as murder. Well, maybe not,
because there's that research now on people with PTSD where they're trying to see if they can erase those particular memories that trigger the PTSD.
Yeah, a different circumstance.
Yeah, but it's still, you're changing the person, but in a good way. It's like using genetic engineering and this kind of technology to solve the problem of Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or something. Who would object to that? You're not trying to build a eugenicist superhuman or anything like that. Just solve problems.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about some of the other objections that you commonly hear. You want to get people to live forever. Okay. What does that mean? How about just get me to 120 without Alzheimer's? Can you do that?
Specifically, what I want is to give people control over their lives and their health. So I'm not saying everyone has to live forever and there's no choice associated with this. The argument I make is that our 85-ish, 80-something years is an arbitrary result of evolutionary forces. And it's clear from the survey data that most people would like to live longer if they can.
Yeah.
And what I want is just to give people actual control over their lives rather than being controlled by fate and decaying biology. And if people choose 120 or 150 or 200, like some whales get and some tortoises get, that should be their choice to make. If they want to live longer still, then that should also be their choice to make. The problem I have is, again, we don't have anti-aging medicine, so that works particularly well. So I don't think I'm going to have a viable means to just get you to 120 or 150 naturally at the moment. But it should always be, as with all medicine, about giving patients more autonomy over their health.
I like that. Sure. I'm for that. My sense is that most people would agree with me. Just get me there, and then I'll let you know when I get to 150. Yeah, I'll go
exactly
200. Make it 200. Sure, I'll have another career, and so on, and then maybe 300, 400. This idea of live forever. I don't even know what that means. It's like telling me that we're in debt $31 trillion. I don't even know what that means. It's these are such big numbers. And what would it mean to live forever? I mean, to me, the religious people have the same problem. You're up in heaven with Jesus forever. It's like, well, that doesn't sound like fun to me. That sounds boring. Or, like Christopher Hitchens described it as celestial North Korea. The dictator knows all your thoughts forever.
Yeah.
Or as he put it, let me riff on that because Hitch is so good. That you don't want to die, and you're tapped on the shoulder at the party, you're having a good time, and told you have to leave. Like, oh no! And not only that, but the party's going to go on without you, and people are going to have fun. Oh no! But worse, he said, would that someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "You can never leave the party."
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a fun party, but come on.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, I think always, as I said, autonomy, control. That's what we want for people. Not forced immortality, but not forced death either.
What about the social objections? We overpopulation. You're gonna have 100 billion, 200 billion people alive. Do we need to go to Mars? Whatever.
I mean, as I point out as an example in the book, people have been very worried about overpopulation for a long time. Something like back when there were only a few 100 million of us on the planet.
Yeah.
And it's not an unreasonable objection to be concerned by resource consumption and what is the carrying capacity of an environment, or will we have enough resources to have people live in good quality, wealth, essentially. But it is a technical question of can it be done or not done? I don't think people should just be saying out of hand immediately, oh, there's no way you could have more people. Because what we've seen over the past century or so is dramatic improvements in agricultural yields, better ways of producing food, and not even just ways that involve more intense resource usage. Because we've bred crops, for example, to be better at producing more food with less land and less fertilizer. And you can imagine doing the equivalent things in other domains as well, where, for example, we've passed peak carbon dioxide emissions at the moment. It's not to say climate change is not still a serious issue, and resource consumption is not a serious issue. But I think if you go through the list, generally what you'll see is it seems like lots of these resource consumption issues are surmountable. And over the long run, we're going to develop technology that lets us have more and more people around, whether that's on Earth or whether that's in space or in wherever it is. So I take it as a serious concern, but definitely dealing with each of these individual problems seems better to me than the status quo, which is, again, millions of people dying every year when they would rather not.
Yeah. Of course, yes, I agree with you completely there. Yeah, and in fact, if anything, it looks like we're going to have a birth dearth coming up here in the next century. Half the world countries are under replacement level now. I think South Korea is 0.7 or something. I mean, they're going to disappear
I think it's
in
about
a century if they don't do something soon. What do you make of people like Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil and so on, who are taking all the super mega vitamins and supplements and having their blood cleansed and this and that? I mean, is there any science there toward longevity that you have hope for?
So I do go through this in the first chapter of the book, where I ask, why do we live 80 years as opposed to 20 years or 200 years like some other animals? What are the forces that shape natural human lifespans? And to spoil the chapter briefly, it turns out that there's essentially a trade-off that happens at an evolutionary level between having animals live longer, but taking longer to reach reproductive age, and having them live shorter lives and just getting to reproductive age and making as many kids as quickly as possible. And this trade-off happens down at the level of each of our individual genes. So a human has 20,000 genes. Each of those genes has all sorts of little variants. And basically, you can tweak those so that they favor a longer life, but, disfavor earlier reproductive age, or vice versa. To the extent where we're even able to show in animal models in the lab, where if you artificially predate animals or you make their environment safer, you see their longevity shrinking or reducing, and their age to reproduction changing as well. The problem with this is it implies that aging is not due to just one or two things going wrong. It's due to lots and lots of little processes, which is why when someone gets old, their cancer risk goes up, their heart disease risk goes up, their dementia risk goes up, their skin sags. It's lots and lots of little optimized processes reaching beyond the end of their optimal window and breaking. And so, as I see it, for an anti-aging drug or set of drugs to work, they'd probably have to deal with a whole bunch of those at once. Now, that's not to say some of them might be more important than others, and it might be the case that if you had a cocktail of 3 or 5 different things, you'd remove a fair chunk of what's going wrong and give people notably longer lives. But I don't see strong evidence that we have things that can do that as of yet. And the problem with this system is I'm also not convinced that things that make animals that live a really short duration live longer will necessarily translate well to longer-lived animals like humans living much longer. And you can see this with things like caloric restriction dramatically increasing worm lives, like doubling or tripling them, but only slightly increasing the lives of rats and possibly actually increasing all-cause mortality in humans, as we've seen recently. So I guess I'm optimistic but skeptical about any of these approaches.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, the literature says the best things are do exercise, don't eat too much, don't drink and smoke, all the boring
Right.
standard stuff that you've heard all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I know I've read all that literature too. It's like, dang, it's just so obvious what I should be doing. and there's no elixir there unless the singularity comes. So what do you make of that? The singularity is near. Okay.
I'm no better person to ask than any other vaguely aware scientist. You need to go. I mean, even the AI researchers have widely different views on how likely that is to happen and what the timeframes are. So I don't dismiss it out of hand. I think it's possible, but I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket.
But the one argument I do like is this idea of escape velocity, where you live 1 year longer for every year that you live. So at some point, you just continue to live forever. But there's some built-in assumptions there that I think are maybe not as solid.
Yeah. I mean, even if you achieve that, which I think we're a long way from achieving as far as I can see, you still also have the issues of like, well, what if you get really sick? Like maybe your body doesn't decay, but a virus can still really harm you, or trauma, or all sorts of other things. So you'd still need to deal with those issues, even if your body was
Don't
unaging.
get run over by a bus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God, this is so interesting. Let's see, what have we left out? Well, there is the question of why we have to age and die in the first place. So you're on board with the evolutionary argument that natural selection selected us to live long enough to be grandparents, but no longer really is necessary.
I think essentially it's not that evolution doesn't want us to die. It just doesn't care, where it looks at the trade-off between earlier reproductive age and living longer, and it selects its optimal point based on how likely things in our environment are to kill us. So if you're a giant whale that nothing can kill, or you're an armored tortoise that nothing can kill, evolution's like, fine, I don't mind delaying your age of reproduction a little bit because you'll be around for forever. So take your time. Whereas if you're a tiny little mouse that everything kills, like a cat, a snake being stepped on, then it's like, you got to get to reproduction as soon as possible. And then if you live longer than that, that's good too, but I don't care because you'll probably be killed by something anyway. Because like the ideal organism would be something that was immortal and reproduced all the time. Like evolution would love that if it could come up with a way of doing that. That would be the dominant organism. It can't, because you can't code that into a genome. You have to make these trade-offs with a limited biology's limited capacities.
Yeah. How old are you, Ariel?
I'm 31.
31? Oh my God, you shouldn't be thinking about these things. No, actually you should, because you have a chance to get there. I'm at 70. I don't think it's going to happen for people like me and Kurzweil, because I think he's almost 10 years older than me, and he's thinking 20, what's his latest, 2045, I think, or 2040 for the singularity. He's going to be pushing it to make it to there. So you have to stay healthy.
I hope you live as long and as healthy a life as you possibly can. But I do suspect that if you want to see the future, you'll likely be making use of preservation. And I hope that works out.
What do you make of these arguments like terror management theory, and that death is good? It brings meaning to life because there's a terminus there, and you have to do stuff to get your career done and your kids, and then you die and all that. I never really thought much about that. It wasn't very encouraging, but philosophers do make that argument.
A previous interviewer I was speaking to described that sort of attitude as cope, and I am somewhat sympathetic to the idea that is cope.
He called it what?
But cope. It's a young person term.
Okay.
Basically, I don't buy it. I don't think the arguments are particularly strong. For example, like people say, well, you need a deadline to give your life meaning. And then I'd be like, okay, but why not 60 years? Would that make my life more meaningful? Or 150 years? Would that make it substantially less meaningful? I think, and I described this in the book in chapter 2, that this sort of attitude is what I would call palliative philosophy, where people have seen that like, well, we are going to die. We need to come up with some way to make that less bad, to comfort ourselves, to sort of cover over the existential terror that comes along with knowledge of our mortality. And I do go through an example in the book as well of how we actually did this for different things in the past. So prior to the advent of anesthesia, if someone needed surgery, then it would just be painful. You could give them alcohol or opiates and it would dull the pain a bit, but it would still be very, very painful. But what you saw is it wasn't that all surgeons were like, I'm so sorry, this is going to be terrible, but you have to endure it, otherwise you'll die. But,
Yes.
but it is truly awful. What you saw is
Yeah.
some surgeons saying the pain is a necessary part of the healing procedure, or it would be bad to remove the pain, which seems insane to us today to
Yes.
hold that mindset. But that's legitimately what they thought, probably as a coping mechanism. And I hear the same thing sometimes when I speak to doctors or scientists who have to deal with cases where patients are terminally ill or have to deal with these sorts of issues where they're really doing good work and they're trying to ensure patients' welfare is as good as possible. But I think in order to protect themselves a bit, they don't think that death is necessarily a tragedy, or people losing out on time they would want is necessarily a tragedy, even though I think that that's not really a strong position to hold.
To me, I mean, the idea of having a terminus, I think what you're really talking about should be talking about as a goal. You should have some end goals, not end of the whole thing, but just like, I want to get to the end of today so I can enjoy family time tonight. I want to get to the weekend so I can spend family time and cycling with my friends. Or I want to get to the end of the year. Or, I want to finish my PhD, or I'm going to finish this next book by 2 years from now. You just keep setting goals further and further out. Why do you need to have a final goal? I never really understood that. What's the point of that?
No, I agree. I mean, people sometimes when I talk, they're like, but Ariel, wouldn't this just mean you'd procrastinate forever? You'd lose all motivation.
No.
And I'm like, I don't think about the fact that I'm probably going to die when I am motivated to complete my PhD, go to a party, go on holiday, see my wife, any of these things. Like I'm motivated by more proximate goals. Some of those are long-term goals. Like I'd love to see what I'm advocating for become part of medical systems. I'd love to see other improvements to the world, but I'm not like I have to get this done before a deadline. I want them in and of themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I guess maybe it is a coping mechanism just to intellectualize it, right? Just to say, well, I'm going to die. Well, at least I have whatever. But just don't think about it. Don't worry about it. Right? Just worry about tomorrow and next year. And I don't know. That's my sense about it. Well, I guess, we'll find out in the end. Do you ever follow any of the stuff about reincarnation or near-death experiences? The claims that consciousness continues on after death. Here, forget the woo-woo stuff, but there are serious neuroscientists, consciousness researchers who claim that there's good evidence consciousness does continue after the death of the brain.
I think about near-death experiences the same way I feel about psychedelics or any other consciousness-altering experience, where they're very informative about if you do weird stuff to brains, you perturb them, you might have a better insight as to how consciousness is happening normally. Sort of in the same way that you get a particle accelerator and you get really weird conditions where you smash stuff together and it gives you some insight into maybe what's going on under normal circumstances. But I don't see any evidence from the literature I've seen that there's an argument for consciousness exists outside of brains. I know people have tried to do things where they have patients who have near-death experiences and they leave their bodies and maybe they can see stuff in the room. And people have run experiments where they're like, well, what if we put a sign up in the near the ceiling or something? Maybe they'd be able to read that. And as far as I'm aware, it hasn't worked.
Because it hasn't worked yet.
Yeah, so I don't buy it.
Yeah. I don't either. But there are some neuroscientists who, again, this consciousness research group that I'm part of, Deepak and Neil Seth and Christoph Koch and Penrose and Hammeroff, these guys, there is a thread there where they want to argue if consciousness is primary, the ground of all being, as Deepak says, whatever that means. Therefore, it has to continue on because it never stopped, right? I don't know. At some point, it just becomes fuzzy language to me, and I just don't see the mechanism of how that would happen.
I'd ask what they think's happening in anesthesia, hypothermia, those circumstances where, it's not a near-death experience. It just seems like it's not there,
It's a process that just turns off. It doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
So my analogy is like my pancreas, whatever it does, something to do with digestion, I guess. When I'm dead, where does the pancreas process go? It doesn't go anywhere. It just stops.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. So, all right, Anel, Ariel, that's an amazing amazing subject that you've tackled there. The future loves you. How and why we should abolish death. What are you working on next?
Trying to see what the next steps for this project are. So as I mentioned, like, can we show that we can extract memories from preserved brains? Can we get better at doing these whole brain emulations? What are the legitimate skepticism that people have about this project? And can we in any way overcome those, see how we could invalidate these arguments, or alternatively, see how they could be strengthened? I really want to push this forwards. Because I really think this could be a means of saving many, many people's lives.
The brain preservation people, the last one they did was on a rabbit or something like that.
It was a pig.
Have they gotten a pig?
But there's some human data now as well. It's been done on humans as well.
Really? Oh, that's good. Interesting. Yeah. Well, good. Make sure that you make this happen before I get to, let's say, 85 or 90.
We'll try.
You got 20 years to figure this out.
I want it as soon as possible. There's lots of people dying now, sadly.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. All right. Thanks, Ariel.